welcome to the Keck Center's event today, 10 years after the killing of Osama bin Laden, Lessons Learned. My name is Hilary Apple, and I'm the director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at Claremont McKenna College. This event is an event which acknowledges that we have been at Claremont McKenna College for 40 years. The Keck Center was founded in 1981, and this is the first of a series of programs that are special programs to recognize our 40th year. And this is also a period where we are counting down the kickoff of Claremont McKenna College's 75th anniversary. So this is a day of retrospection, a day of thought-provoking conversation. It will be led by our professor of international journalism, Terrell Jones, and he will introduce and moderate the event. So please, Professor Jones.
Thanks, Professor Apple, and thanks to all who are attending to help us mark the 40th anniversary of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies. We are exceptionally pleased and happy that we're joined today by Michael Morell, the former acting director and former assistant deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Ambassador Cameron Munter, former ambassador both to Serbia and to Pakistan. Director Morell is joining us from Northern Virginia, but Ambassador Munter is joining us from Prague, the Czech Republic, where it is 9 p.m. So we're especially thankful to Ambassador Munter for joining us at this late hour, his time. Director Morell is from Cuyahoga Falls in Ohio. He graduated with a degree in economics from the University of Akron and earned a master's from Georgetown, also in economics. His initial thought was that he would probably become a teacher. He was interested in education, but one thing led to another. He had submitted an application to the Central Intelligence Agency, which quickly brought him on board as an analyst, and where he remained for 33 years. His career was in analysis, and eventually led to him being the director of the program that produced the Presidential Daily Brief, the PDB, Daily Briefing on National Security Issues for the President. He was later executive assistant to CIA Director George Tenet, and significantly was President George W. Bush's Daily Intelligence Briefer in 2001, which included September 11th, 2001. And we'll hear about that in a bit. Ambassador Munter is a native of right here in Claremont, where he attended school through high school. He earned a bachelor's from Cornell University and his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He taught at UCLA for a few years, but then eventually joined the Foreign Service, where he spent his career as a career diplomat. His overseas assignments included Warsaw, Prague, and Bonn, Germany. He was later deputy chief of mission, the #2 diplomat after the ambassador in Warsaw and in Prague, and later served as ambassador to Serbia and ambassador to Pakistan. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2012 and actually spent 3 years as a professor of practice teaching international relations here in Claremont at Claremont College. He was then the head of the East-West Institute in New York for a few years, which engages in Track 2 diplomacy on international conflict resolution, and is currently a global consultant based in the Czech Republic. Welcome to both of you, and thank you again. First wanted to ask Ambassador Munter about September 11, 2001 itself. You were assigned to the White House with the National Security Council as Director for North and Eastern Europe, but can you just tell us about your day on 9/11?
Sure, very briefly, I found a couple of things out. One is that when you work in the old executive office building, which is next door to the White House, you're very careful about security. You're always locking things up. You're always making sure your safe is shut. On that particular morning, I was on the phone yelling at someone in Hungary when the way they evacuate that building is that basically the Secret Service comes through, grabs you by the scruff of the neck and says, "Get out of here." And I was sputtering, what, my safe is open, my papers are on. They said, "Get out." And so out I went. My colleague, a woman next door, was wearing high heels. And she was clattering down the stairs, and I was clattering. So the two of us clattered down the stairs and headed out. Look, we weren't important enough, like Mike Morell, to be in, with the big shots who were making the decisions. But it was quite clear to us that this was a major break in the way that we had worked. And I would just add that my career up to that time had been focused on Central and Eastern Europe and the transformation to democracy. From that time, there was never an assignment that wasn't focused, at least in part, on counterterrorism.
Director Morell, you had a quite an eventful day that day. Can you sort of just walk us through that day from the time you woke up to when you heard what had happened, and how and when did you start connecting dots as to who was behind the attacks?
Yeah, so I remember the entire day like it was yesterday. I remember every single detail, and to walk through the whole day would literally take us,
The whole day.
all day. But let me sum it up by saying, it was a combination for me of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So an example of the former, as we were flying around the Gulf of Mexico after we left Sarasota, the president asked to see me. So it was the president, his chief of staff, Andy Card, and it was me in his small office on Air Force One. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" It's a kind of direct question you get from a president, particularly from somebody like George Bush. And I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence that would take us with any confidence to a perpetrator. So you're going to get my best. You're going to get my best assessment, right? You're going to get my best guess." And he said, "I understand the caveat. Now move on." And I told him, "Mr. President, there's two nation states that have the ability to do this, Iran and Iraq, but neither one of them has anything to gain, and both of them have everything to lose. So I don't think it's one of them." I said, "Mr. President, when we get to the end of the trail, I am confident we're going to find Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden." And I told him that I was so confident in that I would bet my children's future on it. And that was just based on a knowledge that we had gained over a long period of time of Al-Qaeda and its ambitions and its capabilities, and the previous attacks that it had conducted on the United States, 2 embassies in East Africa, a U.S. naval ship off the coast of Yemen, for example, first World Trade Center attack. So then he said to me, "When will we know?" Which is not a question that you can give a firm answer to. So I did what analysts do. They provide context. So I searched back in my memory for those times when Al-Qaeda had attacked us before, or any terrorist had attacked us before, and how long did it take us to find out who did it. So I said, "Mr. President, in the case of the bombing of the 2 embassies in East Africa, I said it took us 3 days to figure out it was Al-Qaeda. In the case of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, it took us 3 months to figure out it was Al-Qaeda. And in the case of the bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, that killed U.S. servicemen, it took us a year to figure out that went back to the Iranians and to Tehran." So I said, "Mr. President, we may know soon, and then again, it may take us some time." So I had a number of interactions like that with the president during the day, which I put in that intensity of doing the job bucket. The surreal bucket, I think the best example, there were many moments, but the best example is as we were returning to Washington, and as we were on approach to Andrews Air Force Base, the president's military aide, the officer who carries the nuclear football, was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft. And he saw me looking at him and he waved me to come over. And so I went over and he said, "Look." And so I looked out the window and there was an F-16 on the wingtip of Air Force One. And he said, "It's an F-16, it's from the DC Air National Guard. There's another one on the other wingtip." And Terrell, it was so close that you could see the pilot, you could see the pilot's facial features, and you could see the pilot looking at us. And then the military aide said something to me that still sends shivers down my spine. He said, "Do you know what their job is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Their job is, if someone fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach, their job is to put themselves between that missile and the President of the United States." So an example of the surreal.
Wow.
How did the events of that day then affect your career trajectory and your daily work life for the decades that followed? Because that you're talking about 20 years ago this year.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's very similar to Cameron's. So I started in 1980, and for the first 15 years of my career, I did East Asia. So I did a little bit of Southeast Asia, I did a little bit of Japan, I did a little bit of China, and I did a lot of North Korea. So that was all Asia, right? And then I started a series of jobs that you mentioned, right? Running the President's Daily Brief staff, working for George Tenet, briefing George Bush. But 9/11, from the moment of 9/11 till the moment I retired, in whatever job I had, I would say the vast majority of my time was spent on counterterrorism. Just changed everything.
Counterterrorism.
Yes.
I think it's an important discussion because that event was 20 years ago. Many of our students were barely born at that time, if not even. And then even the raid that got Osama bin Laden was 10 years ago next week. Wow, 10 years already. When I mentioned that to people, that's kind of the reaction that we get, but it was probably a very long 10 years for you in between those two events. I'm going to get back to that in a second, but Ambassador Munter, can you talk about the days leading up to the actual raid 10 years ago, and just how did it affect your just your going about your business, or was it really unchanged until the actual day itself?
Well, yeah, and one thing I'd add to that previous comment that you made was that it's easy to forget that American diplomacy and by extension, I suppose, the combined work of diplomats, intelligence, military was quite different before 9/11. And what we are seeing now in 2021 is, and you can see this from the debate about Afghanistan, it's a reflection on what's gone on over the last 20 years, and in many ways how different and how jarring that change was. So I'll leave that as kind of a end of the discussion question mark. But for me, as ambassador in Pakistan, I had been assigned to go out in 2010. And on very sensitive issues like this, there are very few people who are not in the intelligence agencies or in the military who know about it. So I spent a lot of time in the days and weeks and months before the raid, not talking about this to anybody except to a couple of people who were in the intelligence community, because I wasn't allowed to. So when you don't talk about it, your mind gets I don't want to say schizophrenic, but you just do. My job was to do business as usual. Not only because we had plenty of other business to do, but because, it's not a good thing to see patterns change. If there is a big, event like this coming, you don't want to tip anybody off that things are different. So I think that day we lost a volleyball game to the Chinese embassy. In fact, they crushed us. And we were so much, I know this deals in stereotypes, but I had all these 6'7" Marines on my team, and they had a bunch of guys who were not 6'7", and in typical Chinese fashion, they were hugely disciplined and beat the hell out of us, okay? But the good news is that we had a big picnic and ate a lot of great Chinese food. That evening, I invited all of the rectors of all of the Islamic universities of Pakistan to have dinner at my house. This was a great coup because these people were very mistrustful. If you know the background in Pakistan, we have a history of mistrust. The Pakistanis think the Americans are not good allies, and the Americans, many Americans, think the same, and there's a lot of justification on both sides. So there was a lot of suspicion. I had a lot of these rectors, 20 guys with big beards over for dinner. And then I got the phone call that what we had talked about was going to take place that night. And I did what no good ambassador does. I got up, excused myself, and didn't come back to the dinner. So I'm not sure I did great things for, relationships with these Islamic guests. So I was living on the compound. I went into the embassy and needless to say, didn't do any sleeping that night.
Get back to that in a moment, but Director Morell, how about your week leading up to the actual event? Did you get much sleep?
So, my involvement in this goes back to, went back to August of 2010, when the head of our counterterrorism center first told Director Panetta and I about this individual named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and how relevant he was and a potential courier to bin Laden, and how we had identified him after looking for him for 9 years. And we had found him at this compound. So, I had been working very hard in general, and then add the bin Laden hunt on top of that from August 2010. And I'd been working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the couple of weeks before the raid, we were having daily early morning deputies committee meetings at the White House, chaired by John Brennan and Dennis McDonough. And it was, is there anything new? Tell us about the preparations. How are they going? How are we thinking about this, right? How are we thinking about Pakistani reaction, and what are we going to do about it, right? So going through every morning, going through issues. And the ambassador may remember, but we were running one last operation to try to confirm that bin Laden was there, right? The analysis that came to the conclusion that he was there was entirely circumstantial. There was no direct evidence. And the president, of course, would have liked to have some direct evidence. So we were running one more operation, and I was briefing that operation every morning. And it ultimately failed to confirm that bin Laden was there. But so I would go to the White House every morning, update on that, update on other things, hear what everybody else was doing, including Bill McRaven and his SEALs who were in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, staging for the raid. And then back to the agency and having the same kind of conversations with my officers there.
Yeah, and I would add that, when we talk about this, people talk about the questions of how the raid works, et cetera, which was not something operationally that diplomats get involved in, but very much I was involved in conversations with Washington about, as Michael said, what's going to be the damage to the relationship with Pakistan, what's the likely fallout. And I was touched that Mr. Brennan actually asked me, well, do you think we ought to tell the Pakistanis? And I remember saying, no. I know my job is going to have to be to clean up the mess, but we certainly don't want to tell the Pakistanis. It was just too much of a risk and too much of this was so important. We had to get it right.
So Ambassador Munter, when you left the dinner and went back to the embassy, you summoned your senior staff in and basically sequestered them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, what happened is that in this particular case, we had plans I had plans in my head that I had not been able to talk with my staff about what would happen in such a case. But I had to get my staff ready. So the political counselor, the consul, the administrative people, et cetera, all these people, I called them in to the embassy, and they came to the conference room at the embassy, and they looked at me and said, okay, this is a big deal. You're calling us in at night. What are we here for? I say, I can't tell you. Wait in this room, and I'll come back to you when I can. I have no doubt that they talked among themselves and may have even guessed what was going on, but they didn't know. And then I went to secure part of the embassy, where I actually was able to sit down with my intelligence chief and watch the raid while it happened on a screen, where the famous picture of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and all that. We were watching them watch that and hearing the brief as it happened, and actually watching a feed that is, I would argue, very similar to what you saw in the movie Zero Dark 30.
At this point, I wanted to ask Director Morell and then also you, Ambassador Munter, about the dynamics of the relationship between the diplomatic staff and an ambassador and the intelligence staff at a station in a foreign embassy. How much do you or can you talk to each other, and how much can you know about what each other are doing?
And maybe I'll go first, and then the ambassador can give an on the ground view. We're both there for the same purpose, right? We're both there to further the national interests of the United States. That's number one. Number two is the instructions that our chiefs of station get, both in writing and orally from the director or the deputy director before they go out, is you are responsible for keeping the ambassador informed of not the details of an operation or even individual operations, but the general contours of what it is you are doing, number one. And number two, you're responsible for keeping the ambassador informed of anybody that you've recruited that the ambassador may run into. That's very important. Or anybody, at a very senior level in the government, the ambassador needs to know that. So those are the instructions that are given. Sometimes chiefs of station do a good job following those instructions, and sometimes they don't. So I'll let the ambassador talk about his experiences.
Well, I would add that, I had an excellent chief of station there, and he was a guy who did his best because, you have to trust that he has a million projects he's working on. And this is not unique to the station chief at an embassy. The guy who's running AID programs, we had a massive AID program. He has to keep me apprised of what's happening, but he can't tell me every well they're digging in Punjab. So this is not unique, but it's very important with the station chief, and especially in a case like this, that I have a notion of the context of what's going on. And so we had no problem with that. I had a lot of catching up to do when it came to the point where operationally this event, which I didn't know the details about, I had been briefed for months about the prospect that this would happen, but I didn't know the details. I didn't really get briefed on it until that evening when I came in. But we had a good relationship, and it's a relationship that's based on, again, it has to be based on trust. This is not only a guy who you have to respect intellectually. I'll say guy or gal. If you're watching Homeland, we know that it's men and women. But you have to respect them intellectually, but you also have to know them kind of emotionally, because as we watched the raid, there was a lot of, kind of wet armpits. We were worried, about, the success of this question that Michael Morell has mentioned about, are we sure that this is the place that this is, bin Laden? No one knew, and we would find out that evening. So it was, it's a relationship that's very important, and it's one that it's human. People make mistakes, but it's one that has to be very open.
We're getting closer to the point where we would like to open up for question and answers. So if anyone in the audience does have a question, please put it through the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to it in our question and answer period. But I wanted to jump to the other part of the theme of our discussion today about lessons learned. And I wonder, first, Director Morell, if you could talk about, how did that raid affect U.S.-Pakistani relations, or even U.S. relations with the Middle East in the immediate months afterward? And has it had a long-term effect, or was it kind of a blip and we've gotten over it and moved on?
Yeah, I'll let the ambassador talk about the impact on the relationship with Pakistan, because he knows it so much better than I do. He'll remember that a few weeks after President Obama sent Mark Grossman and myself out to Pakistan to try to help repair the relationship. And I don't know whether we did a good job or not, but I'll let him talk about that. But I think, for me, there's a couple of really important lessons. One is the power of what you can accomplish when you stay focused on it and when you bring the right resources to bear and you put the right people to work on it. It is actually very difficult to find a human being who's hiding. It took the FBI 17 years to find the Unabomber on the FBI's turf. It took the FBI 6 years to find the bomber at the Atlanta Olympics. And that was on their turf. So you can imagine how much more difficult it is when somebody's hiding on somebody else's turf. So it really shows you the power of what's possible when you really focus your efforts. And I think that had a really positive impact in the agency and for the intelligence community in general. I'd say the other thing that it didn't teach, because I think some of us in the intelligence community, not all of us, but some of us in the intelligence community already knew, but it reinforced it, which is that you can't capture and kill your way to victory in this fight against extremism. After 9/11, the United States became exceptionally good at dealing with terrorists who were already created. And we and our allies and our partners did a not so good job on stopping the creation of terrorists in the first place. And, in my view, we needed after 9/11, and we still need to do a much better job in that area. Because, I felt as fast as the United States was taking them off the battlefield, they were putting new guys on the battlefield. And so I think there needed to be two prongs to the dealing with extremists. And we were only dealing with one, and I'm afraid that's probably still true today.
Yeah,
John, if I could finish then.
Yeah, I would just add absolutely to what Michael said is that we got very good at doing exactly what we had to do that night. Those guys were, flawless in what they did. But the issues that we were dealing with, the threat to America and overall the road to a sustained, peaceful, prosperous relationship in that part of the world, et cetera, this is only a little part of what we needed to do. We did tend to focus, in my opinion, too much on that. We got so good at that we lost some of our focus on some of the other things that I think we haven't yet come to, but at least I'm heartened by the debate in Washington that we realize that we have to do that. We can't let down our guard on counterterrorism, but we do have to expand the aperture on how we deal with other countries. Now, in the particular case of Pakistan, our relationship had been in pretty serious trouble for a number of years. And I think there were events in that year, 2011, three events. One was the so-called Raymond Davis case, when a CIA contractor was involved in a shooting, and then we had to get him out of jail. The Bin Laden raid, and then a raid that went wrong from across the border in the place called Salalah in Pakistan, where a number of Pakistani soldiers were inadvertently killed by American and Afghan soldiers. These three events, I described it, I said, I grew up in California, in a town where there's these foothills north of town, and they're like the Margalla Hills that are north of Islamabad. And they're full of stones, and they're full of brush and nasty. And my experience that year was like rolling naked down that hill, right? Just one after another. Ouch, 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 ouch. We were just going downhill. Michael Morell and Mark Grossman and other people came out to Pakistan to try to convince the Pakistanis that this was not a raid aimed at them. It was aimed at international terrorism. Everyone tried hard to do that. But I would just say that this whole experience, this year, was where we hit a low point. And I would say it was a kind of a turning point. From that point, our relations with Pakistan have not been able to recover. And in that sense, when I say recover, there was a lot of effort. There was a gentleman named Richard Holbrook, who had been previously in charge of our policy, who had pumped up, as only this man could do. He was an extraordinary human being. He had pumped up expectations for how Pakistan and America could work together. We have never tried to do that since. The relationship with Pakistan since that time can be better, can be worse, but it is nowhere near as intensive. And for better or worse, it was a turning point in the relationship with Pakistan. Now, one of the things you learn as a diplomat is you don't go overseas to just basically sit around, and sometimes, in all cases, you don't go to make friends. You go out to represent American policy. And a lot of times ambassadors forget that, and they say, if I go to Switzerland and relations are here, and I leave Switzerland and relations are here, I've been successful. Well, I feel I was successful because we did with Osama bin Laden what we needed to do, but it didn't win us friends in Pakistan. And so it was a very clear illustration of what happens in diplomatic crisis is not always pleasant, but it's necessary. Then when you think this question about what happens 10 years later, I do think that there is a chance now for a renewal of the relationship with Pakistan, but it's based on a reassessment of all of the questions about relationship that we have to have, and it's long overdue.
One last question to put to you both before we go to Q&A, and starting with Director Morell. How do you think the effect of the success of the bin Laden raid, the continued American efforts against Al-Qaeda and then Islamic State have had an effect on that threat of terrorism? Counterterrorism, you said, has been a main concern of yours in the years after 9/11. Is the world safer from Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, similar threats, perhaps as a result of the bin Laden raid, or might you say despite the bin Laden raid?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things, and they're going to sound a bit in contrast, I think. The United States had, up to the Abbottabad raid, the United States had been pounding Al-Qaeda in South Asia, and had significantly degraded it even before bin Laden was killed. And my view was the killing of bin Laden degraded it even more, and in a very significant way. And I'll tell you today, Al-Qaeda in the AfPak border region there is nowhere near as capable as they were on September 10th, 2001. So that's a good thing, and the bin Laden raid played a role in that. I think the flip side of the coin is, if bin Laden were still alive today, and you asked him to assess where his movement is and how he feels about where his movement is, I think he would be pretty happy. Because, on September 10th, there were several hundred Al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan. And now there are 15,000 or so extremists from West Africa through the Middle East into South Asia and into Southeast Asia. And many of them are local insurgent groups who largely have local grievances, but they've taken on either the Al-Qaeda or the ISIS ideology. And so the threat has metastasized. And I think that bin Laden would be very, very happy with that. Having said all of that, I guess the final point I would make is that we expended over the past 20 years extraordinary resources on preventing another attack in the homeland. And we were successful in doing that. But it came at a cost. And it came at a cost in terms of relationships with other countries, as Cameron has talked about. It came at a human cost to the United States in terms of the soldiers we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it came at an extraordinarily high financial cost in the trillions and trillions of dollars. And during that 20 years, while we were focused on that counterterrorism and counterinsurgency fight, and we were paying that high cost, China and Russia were retooling their conventional militaries. And in China's case, its economy and its high technology industries to take us on as a nation, right? And we weren't focused anywhere near as much on that as we should have been, given the focus that we had on terrorism. And I think President Biden is now doing the right thing by trying to shift that focus. And that is exactly the right thing to do. Now, we can't shift it so much that we miss a revival of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But I think a shift is in order and is necessary.
And Ambassador Munter, just briefly, before we go to the Q&A, I think you have a strong opinion about that too, that perhaps the United States focused too much on terrorism coming out of the Middle East and not enough on threats from the other side of the world.
Well, no, I would say almost word for word what Michael has said, which is it's not that it wasn't necessary for us to do this, but there's some foreigners who love America but criticize America, say things like, the Americans, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. They will say you go too far in this direction, and we can argue that it's not so much that we did a bad job degrading the capability of people who wanted to do us harm, who were living in the Pakistani tribal areas. We did a good job on that. But the point that Michael makes that I agree with is, imagine if we had been using some of that money that we used on climate change, on the kind of things that smart people have been warning about pandemics. In other words, there are other claims, whether it's great power rivalries with Russia and China, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change. This was lost opportunities. These were lost opportunities, and we are now at least trying to pull a balance where we at least try to figure out how do we balance that better. And it's a tough thing to do, but that's the choice that our leaders made. And it's important to remember, as you, Terrell, began, we were talking about 9/11, that the trauma, if you will, of 9/11 had a lot to do with the decision-making of our political leadership and the support that those leaders had from the public in really focusing on counterterrorism. We did that because we all thought it was the right thing, but we have to be honest with ourselves now that it may be time to shift our focus.
I think those comments from both of you are really important to younger people, such as college students today, because all they've grown up with, all they've known is the threat coming from the Middle East or from non-state terrorism. And the actual threat that will be looming in the rest of their lifetimes is what you both talked about, and is certainly worth that attention. We have some questions that I'd like to get to. First, we have a CMC junior, Sarah Chin, who wanted to pose a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time today. This question is to either panelist. Drones played a large role in collecting forensic intelligence for tracking Osama bin Laden. Do you see an increasing reliance on drone technology for information collection in the future over human intelligence or for targeted strikes? And how has the intelligence agency dealt with ethical considerations for either usage?
So maybe I should take that. I'll say a couple things. One is, drones are a capability that allow you to go where you don't want to send humans because it's too dangerous. And so you're making a decision to use a drone to collect intelligence or to conduct a strike because it would put US servicemen or women at significant risk to get in a helicopter or get in a plane and do that job themselves, or intelligence officers on the ground. So yes, they're used. They were used 10 years ago. They're still in use. I think they will increasingly be used be used around the globe. From an ethical consideration, I lived through this in the Obama administration, and I can't think of an administration who would take as much time as the Obama administration took to work through all of the legal issues, both US domestic law and international law, and be very, very careful about that. A decision that President Obama ultimately made was to be transparent, much more transparent about it than we had been earlier, which I think is a really important thing. I think the United States has to be able to stand up and explain what it's doing and why, and take responsibility when they fail, and say when they were successful. And I think, all that is really important. So, at the end of the day, what the US government did in that region of the world for a period of time, I was comfortable with ethically. And I know the president himself was comfortable with it.
And let me just add one little footnote to that. People talk about ethics. And in fact, when I left the Foreign Service, the first thing I taught was a course at Columbia Law School on ethics, among other things, of things like drone warfare. And we tend to think about, international law and the details about, what is, in the law of war, what is legal. I think one thing that is very important to note about this technology is that the leadership has to take into account, and I think President Obama and then Vice President Biden thought about this, it makes it sometimes easier to do things that are dangerous and perhaps controversial than it would. It's a technology that enables things to happen that you might not do. And so this puts what drones have done, in my opinion, is they've made even a greater responsibility on the civilian leadership of the military and of the intelligence agencies to be very, very careful, very judicious in the use of the drones, because you can do things that you couldn't do, and therefore you have to think through what will be the results of those things. It's just a bigger burden on people. And I think that will be one of the legacies of what the development of drone warfare has brought.
I think, can I just say one more thing about this? This is really important, is when the United States decides to do something in the world, one of the things it has to think about, because it's the United States, is what message it sends to the rest of the world in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. So when you make a decision to use a weapon system in a particular way, you are telling the rest of the world this is okay. So, and I know President Obama thought about that, right? That weighed heavily on him with regard to the use of drones to kill terrorists, right? Because we're telling the rest of the world, okay, it's okay to do that. And so that is something that, at least during the Obama administration, was on the negative side of the ledger, right, for doing this. So it's a really important point, I think.
Thank you for the question and the answers. Now there is Noel Patterson, who is also a junior here at CMC.
Much for your talk. My that years.
Sorry, Noel, your sound is kind of breaking up. Can you start again and maybe just enunciate closer to the microphone?
Apologies. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we heard you say, can you hear me?
Apologies. My component to the U.S. defense and economic apparatus do you see being more heavily mobilized? What other resources in the State Department and auxiliary components do you see being a necessity for higher prioritization? Thank you.
So I think the question is what kind of economic and technological means could also be maybe accelerated to be used as instruments in the future? Is that how? And I'm sorry, Noel, that the sound was breaking up somewhat. If that's not correct, then, well, first of all, is there a way to answer that question, Ambassador Munter, perhaps?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Oh, okay. Noel, can you maybe put it into chat, and we'll try to circle back around to it. And I'm sorry that, yeah, we just didn't get the first part of the question. So it was just something about economics and technology, but please do that. We'd like to get to that question. We do have one that was sent in advance. This is from an incoming first-year student who will be a first year this coming September at CMC, Olivia Wee, who says that recently President Biden announced that he will withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of September 11. Can you talk about the safety of the Afghans who aided the US against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, such as interpreters and intelligence assets? What can the US and should the US do for these people?
Again, I'll take a quick cut, and Michael, I think you're in Washington, you probably hear that more. I can only say this is something that is being hotly debated in Washington, not only from members of the government, but also members of Congress, et cetera. There is a very strong feeling that we owe our loyalty to those people who worked with us. And I think the wheels are turning in Washington to try to do what we can in this period between now and the sometime before 9/11 deadline of departing to address exactly that. I can only say that I don't work in the government anymore. I don't know what they're planning, but boy, is there a debate about exactly what you've asked. Michael?
Yeah, and I would add that that debate exists because
Michael, you've frozen, I think, here.
Yeah, Director Morell is frozen on screen there. Maybe while that is trying to be worked out, let me go back. Noel Patterson has texted in his question, and that was, as the US pivots toward strategic competition, what components of the US defense and economic apparatus do you see being more heavily mobilized? What other resources in the State Department and auxiliary components do you see a necessity for high prioritization in this endeavor? Ambassador Munter, can you address that?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll do my best. As the United States pivots towards strategic competition, that is because of the change that began under the Trump administration, but that is continuing under the Biden administration, to see the main threats going away from the tradition of simply terrorism first, most, and last, toward competition with China and Russia, especially, and in the so-called pivot to Asia. Yes, it should be. It should be. I hope. I agree with the Biden administration that it should be both a diplomatic and a military effort. The military gets a lot more resources than the State Department. And so I think there are plans to give the State Department more resources, specifically to train more people in more 21st century issues. That is, most of our diplomats are generalists, people like me who were trained in history. And we don't have a lot of people who are really good in the issues of cyber. We don't have a lot of people who are really as aware of AI issues and can speak to those issues, climate change, things of that sort. So some of the resources that should go to state and will go to state according to the new government will be getting more people into diplomacy and having our diplomacy be more literate, if you will, in the challenges of the 21st century. Now, does that mean that we're not going to pay for our Defense Department? Of course not. And I think the other challenge is that the Defense Department is aware that it can't fight the last war. It can't simply procure the same weapons and train people the same way that it did before. And before 9/11, we were trained, our military was trained kind of in a Cold War manner. to stop the Soviets from taking over Western Europe. Then all of a sudden they had to learn how to do counterterrorism and jump out of helicopters and things like that. Now they have to retrain. And I guess this is what you're getting at, not only with more resources, but with more thought. What are the actual ways that you want to counter China and Russia? You don't really want to fight a war with China and Russia. What do you want to do? You have to have people who are aware how you fight a cyber attack or resist a cyber attack, how you deal with issues in different ways. So yes, it's happening. There are changes. I think more resources will go to the State Department. And I think that the military is aware that it has to do radical reform in order to meet the new challenge.
Joe, can I just jump in here? Can I just jump in here because I just want to reinforce what Cameron said. The main struggle, the main challenge that the United States faces for the next 25, 50 years is China. How do we deal with the rise of China? And it is not the challenge the US faces is over who has more influence in the world, right? And how that influence is used. And that is being fought not on military grounds, right? Or ideological grounds even. It's being fought on economic, technological, and diplomatic grounds. So if that's where the fight is, if that's where the struggle is, if that's where the challenge is, then that's where you want to put your resources. I could take 1%. This is going to be music to Cameron's ears. If I could take 1% of the Defense Department budget and give it to the State Department, it would be a significant boost for the State Department. 1%.
Yeah, and make no mistake, our military friends in uniform almost all agree with this. The famous quote from James Mattis that, if you don't fund diplomacy, I have to buy more ammunition. It's very true. And so this is something that has broad support, I think, in Washington.
Thank you both. I'm glad we got that question in from Noel. Next, we have Jason Yasakochi, who is a junior at CMC.
Yes, thank you two so much for speaking today. I'd like to ask a question about the current realm of counterterrorism, which seems to not just be centered in the Middle East, but also Africa. I know in Sahel, there's frustration that the United States and the G5 as a whole have maybe a too narrow and militaristic approach to counterterrorism that can do more harm than it can help. Do you believe that a more holistic approach with greater attention towards governance and conflict resolution needed, or is this narrow approach justified?
And could I just add to that question, because it dovetails with another one that was sent in about the Sahel, which you mentioned, Jason, that area of sub-Saharan Africa from west to east. The question that the additional question is to Director Morell: what kind of power does Al Qaeda hold in Africa, and more specifically in the Sahel region? So you could address both of those.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier, right? Is you can't just take a military approach to this. You can't just kill and capture your way out of this. There's a wonderful, wonderful Israeli documentary called The Gatekeepers. And it's an hour long, and it's interviews with every single former living director of Shin Bet, which is their domestic counterterrorism service. So the first 45 minutes of this documentary are these guys talking about the extraordinary things they did to protect their country from Palestinian terrorists. The last 15 minutes was each of them to a person criticizing their government for not coming to a political resolution with the Palestinians. And their argument was what I said earlier, right? As long as there was no political settlement to that problem, political resolution to that problem, then the terrorists were just going to keep on coming. So yeah, I can deal with them one at a time, but if you could stop the flow, right, through a political resolution, doesn't that make a lot more sense? And I think that's to Jason's question.
And the other one was about Al Qaeda in the Sahel.
Yeah, so Al Qaeda is still in Africa, but the real problem in Africa is ISIS. ISIS has a pretty significant stranglehold on Africa. It is actually significantly worrying to European nations who, fear these folks coming their way. Now, how do you deal with that? I think you deal with it just the way I talked about, in a holistic way. and you try to, from an intelligence perspective, from a legal law enforcement perspective, from a military perspective, you try to use local forces, local assets as much as you can, giving them the resources they need and the training they need before you step in and do that work for them, because that has significant consequences for the United States.
I'm going to combine two questions here about the raid on the Abbottabad compound. Director Morell, could you speak, well, actually either of you, if you care to, can you speak about the long-term effects of the fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan to gain intelligence prior to the raid on the bin Laden compound? And also, what if that raid had gone wrong? And what were contingency plans, and how might that have affected U.S.-Pakistani relations? You know, I recall the the raid, the Jimmy Carter raid, failed raid to get the hostages out of Tehran, which went badly wrong. Could you address either of those, Director Morell, the fake vaccination campaign, and what would have happened if?
Yeah, the only thing I can say about the vaccination program is it wasn't fake. So when I read about fake vaccination programs, that word fake drives me crazy. It wasn't fake. Children were vaccinated. Now, there were significant consequences of people believing that the CIA was behind a fake vaccination program, right? Doctors and nurses were no longer welcome in parts of Pakistan, as the ambassador knows. So significant consequences to the belief out there that there was a fake vaccination program going on. But anything that the intelligence community involved in, there was nothing fake about it. On the Abbottabad raid, right? I mean, there's two possible ways it could have gone wrong. One is we could have gone in and he wasn't there. The reason President Obama decided to make this not a US military operation, but a covert action, so that the line of authority didn't go from President Obama to Bob Gates to Bill McRaven. It went from President Obama to Director Panetta to Bill McRaven. The reason President Obama did that is if we went in and he wasn't there, and if we got out without anybody noticing it, we would deny it forever. Never happened, right? The other way it could have gone wrong, right, is if a number of those SEALs had been injured or killed, right? That's the other way it could have gone wrong. And there were contingency plans to in the case of the Pakistani military showing up. I'm not going to share those with you, but there were contingency plans. But I will say that throughout the Situation Room discussions on the raid, there was one person who kept on reminding us that something always goes wrong with every military operation. Something always goes wrong. And I was sitting in this very room in 1979 when we tried to rescue the hostages in Tehran. And we know how that ended in the desert of Iran. And so he reminded us over and over again, Bob Gates reminded us about that fact. And when that helicopter went down that night in the compound, my first thought was Bob Gates was right. So a couple of answers there. Not full answers, but I'm sorry, I can't do better than that.
Yeah. Well, look, from the perspective of the embassy on this last question about what if it had gone wrong? In terms of the relationship that we have with Pakistan, it wouldn't have made any difference. It was bad. That is to say, for the relationship, that is, we had a crisis that we had to manage our way out of, and bin Laden was dead. And let's say bin Laden hadn't been dead, he got away and the SEALs were killed or something terrible like this happened, it still would have been the same kind of crisis with the Pakistanis, because the Pakistani leadership, especially the Pakistani military leadership, seemed to us to be a lot less concerned about bin Laden and a lot more concerned about the fact that we could get in past their defenses and humiliate them the way we did. So if it had gone wrong, it still would have been a humiliation and it still would have been a problem.
I want to try to race through a couple of things. We have more questions that unfortunately we're able to get to. There are more than a dozen that remain in the queue, but to combine a couple of them, what are the greatest terrorist concerns for the United States today? And is Al-Qaeda still a threat?
So I think the greatest terrorism threat to the United States today is domestic terrorism in the United States. I think that the extremist threat from overseas certainly exists, but it's at a low point. Now, it could rebound. It could absolutely rebound under certain scenarios, and we can't forget that. But I think the greatest threat is the domestic terrorism threat, which is driven by our own dysfunctional politics.
And Al-Qaeda remaining a threat, Ambassador Munter, might you take that, or would you prefer?
No, let's throw that back to Michael too. I think he knows more than I.
So I think ISIS is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda. I do worry. Look, I think President Biden made absolutely the right decision in Afghanistan. 20 years, there's no public support left for the US being there. It wasn't a decision for President Biden whether to stay at 2,500 or withdraw. The decision was to withdraw or plus up to 15,000 again, because those 2,500 guys can't protect themselves and would be vulnerable to the Taliban if Biden said we're staying and we're only keeping 2,500. So it was absolutely the right decision, but it wasn't made without an understanding of exactly what's going to happen here. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. The Taliban is going to take over Afghanistan again. It's just a matter of time. And the question will be, will they allow Al-Qaeda to regain their strength and again plan and conduct terrorist operations out of Afghanistan? There's some who argue absolutely they will, and there's some who argue no, they won't, and we can influence that, right, diplomatically, particularly through aid. So we'll see on that, but that's what I worry about the most in terms of a rebound in Al-Qaeda. But the much bigger external threat at the moment is ISIS.
Could I add one thing about that is that, when we talk about the great power competition, what we're talking about is a new way in which America is talking to allies about things like China. And one of the countries we are working with is India through the so-called Quad. We work much more with India than we have in a long time. India has certain relationships in Afghanistan. Similarly, Iran has relationships in Afghanistan. Russia has relationships in Afghanistan. So the effort to try to work on the new, let's call it the new great power competition, it's not like terrorism isn't a part of that. It's not like all these countries don't care about terrorism and we will either be able to work with them or not work with them. But it's not like we're all going to put terrorism in a different category and just compete in different ways. Terrorism, the way we deal with terrorism will be changed by the way we deal in the great power competition. And stay tuned. We're not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what that looks like. But counterterrorism will remain. It will just be different.
And in these competitions that we have with Russia and China, areas of cooperation can be extraordinarily helpful, right? And one area of potential cooperation with both Russia and China is counterterrorism.
Exactly.
We're kind of at our time, but you gentlemen have time for 2 more questions.
Sure.
I'm taking advantage of the opportunity of getting you both in the same place at the same time. Let me just go quickly, just to follow up on what you were saying, Director Morell, about about counterterrorism. How can you prevent terrorist groups from being creative and prevent existing groups from growing? What kind of approach would be needed?
Look, I think the reason that extremists become extremists and are willing to resort to violence are extraordinarily complicated. And they're numerous. And they have to do with an actual lack of knowledge of these individuals about their religion, and therefore allowing others to warp the religion to create a narrative that encourages them to violence, right? That's one reason. Another is, socioeconomic conditions in countries where young men aren't left with any other possibilities. So there are many reasons and many layers here. And I think, the reason that we haven't been aggressive at dealing with the root causes is twofold. Or threefold. One is we were being attacked, and that's where your attention is, right? On the guys attacking you. It's like if two gang members were trying to break in your home and kill your family, right? Your focus is going to be on those two guys. The last thing you're going to think about are the socioeconomic conditions that created the gang in the first place. So that's one. Two is the policy approaches that would be necessary to deal with the root causes are incredibly complicated. And then the third reason is the United States doesn't have complete control over that. In fact, we have very little control over it, right? These are policy choices that are necessary by these countries themselves, right? By the leaders of Muslim countries, by clerics in Muslim countries, by parents in Muslim countries, by teachers in Muslim countries, right? So we have very little influence, which is another reason we've not focused on it.
And this last question to both of you revolves around something that you both slightly mentioned, but that is China. One is Pakistan seems to be aligning itself more closely with China in recent years. How does that affect U.S. interests in the region? And also what U.S. strategies might be if China moves to reclaim Taiwan? And as a kicker to that, just to end off everything, what might you do differently knowing what you do now? So China, Pakistan, China, Taiwan, and
I'll take a little bit of that. A little Pakistan piece I'll comment on. Look, Pakistan, America considered Pakistan, or has designated Pakistan, a non-alliance kind of ally, and that is kind of now in the breach. It's much more that Pakistan, to be blunt about it, America's lost a lot of its attention on Pakistan, in part because of the winding down of the Afghan war and our tendency to look at Pakistan through the lens of the Afghan war, but also because we are switching to focusing more on China, et cetera. So there's less attention, I would argue, being paid to Pakistan. This is good and bad. The attention that was paid to Pakistan was usually Pakistan is a terrorist state, there's bombs going off. It was very negative kind of attention, both in the press and elsewhere, to Pakistan. Pakistan has an opportunity, I would argue, to recast itself with domestic reforms and things of that sort, should it choose to do so. Now, part of the way they want to do that is that they have a country that seeks, it's a dysfunctional country and it seeks aid from other countries. It's not getting it from the United States anymore, but it is getting it with strings attached from the Chinese. Pakistan's relationship with China is wary, despite all the protestations about how strong that is. And so Pakistan is, in a way, it's not a question of US losing an ally or China gaining an ally. Pakistan is kind of at an inflection point, if you will, where it has to decide whether it's going to punch at its weight. It's the 5th biggest country in the world. It's not a little country. And is it going to do the necessary reforms that it can speak to the Chinese, that it can speak to the Americans, to the Indians, from a position of some security, or is it going to continue to be the dependent country that it is? So my argument would be to recast your question, not who's going to win or lose an ally, but is Pakistan going to take advantage of this opportunity to reform itself so it has a healthier relationship with the big fish in the world? On the other questions, I would love to punt to my friend who lives closer to Washington and see how he handles those.
Well, Director Morell, in China, Taiwan.
Yeah, China, Taiwan. This is a very hot issue at the moment because the Chinese have been extremely aggressive in the last couple of months with regard to military maneuvers vis-a-vis Taiwan. Having said that, I'll tell you that the road to war between China and Taiwan goes through either Taipei. So if Taiwan declared independence tomorrow, I am 99.99% sure that the Chinese would go to war. And then Washington. So there are discussions in this town, both inside the government and outside the government, about two things. One is about ending our one China policy. In other words, recognizing Taiwan. And then two, ending the policy of strategic ambiguity about under which conditions we would come to the defense of Taiwan. There are people like Richard Haas, who runs the Council on Foreign Relations, who are arguing that we should be unambiguous, that if attacked by China, we will come to the defense of Taiwan. And if we did either one of those things, end the one China policy by recognizing Taiwan, or if we changed that strategic ambiguity to no ambiguity and made Taiwan a straight up ally, we would see a response by the Chinese. In fact, I would tell you that the reason the Chinese are doing what they're doing with regard to their show of strength vis-a-vis Taiwan is because of the conversation in the United States. That's what they're watching. That's what they're trying to influence. And so the last thing the Chinese want to do is invade Taiwan. The Chinese know they have bigger issues that they have to deal with, right? They have to figure out a way to avoid the middle income trap, right? To get stuck in their development at the point they're at now, right? They have to figure out a way to avoid that, and invading Taiwan would make that extremely difficult because of the way the rest of the world would react. So they don't want to do it, but they could be forced to do it by either Taiwan itself or by the United States acting not in a smart way.
Finally, that question about what might you do differently, knowing what you know now, was directed to Director Morell.
Everything. Look, I think, there are so many things that I've learned in life that if I knew, 30 years ago, I would have done differently. But if I had to pick one, since I've had now time to think about it, is I would be less of a micromanager in terms of how I managed things at the agency. I think if I had been much less of a micromanager than I was, the job would have gotten done just as well. People would have developed their skills faster, and I would have spent more time with my family.
Terrell, if I can dive in unannounced on this, I would just throw the question back to the audience, which is, as you think, these were very good and intelligent questions, and I scrolled through the questions that we didn't get to. I do hope, as you think of what you're going to be doing, that you will consider government service, that you'll consider the fact, at least for someone like me, to have the honor to work with someone like Michael Morell, and to deal with these kinds of questions. Don't just go to Goldman Sachs and make a lot of money. Consider, because, Terrell, for example, he's a very rich guy,
Journalism, education.
My point is, do consider government service. And I hope the debate that you've had with us, or the discussion you've had with us, I think that you can see from both Michael Morell and from me, I'm delighted to have chosen these careers. And we felt that we really were in the middle of a lot of really, really important and interesting things. I hope you can be part of it too.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. And you guys are the future. And unfortunately, we've left you with a bit of a mess on a lot of things, right? Divided politics, climate change, income inequality, you name it, we've screwed it up. So you're our future. I spend a lot of time on college campuses, and one of the things that makes me hopeful for the future of our country is how good our students are. And you guys, based on the questions you asked, are as good as any.
Well, we would love to be able to hear that message from you in person someday in the future. Ambassador Cameron Munter and Director Michael Morell, thank you so much for joining us today on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Keck Center for International Strategic Studies and on behalf of Claremont McKenna College. It's past 10 o'clock in Prague where you are, Ambassador, so thank you again for joining us, and we greatly appreciate this unparalleled opportunity to hear from both of you about this momentous event 10 years ago from the two different sides of the world from where you were watching it unfold before your eyes. So once again, thank you, Professor Apple, for facilitating and making this event possible. And please join me virtually, I'm sure, in thanking you again for joining us today.